Hi everybody, Andrew Weir here. Thanks so much for stopping by again. Just a quick hello before we start the video today. I've got a very special offer for all my subscribers this week, so please make sure you stick around to the end of the video to find out what that is. And if you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe and click the bell down below to get a notification every time I put up a new video, and you'll be eligible for the offer that I've got for everyone this week. Thanks so much, let's get into it. Hey everybody, and welcome to week 3 of my guitar improv primer. Hopefully from last lesson you've got a few tools at your disposal now to really help you get through those 3-note string major scales all over the fretboard. This week we're going to take a similar approach but look at our arpeggios. We're going to use some exercises and ideas to really start learning these all over the fretboard, and we'll take a look at different concepts like just simple arpeggios from a tonic, as well as some 2-1-2 legato arpeggios that I lean towards a little bit. There'll be a few more playing examples this week, hence my beautiful headphone necklace here, and hopefully we'll have a bit of fun too. There'll be 3 different backing tracks included with this week's lesson, so again, if you need those, please message me at my website and I'll get those straight to you. Alright, let's get into it. Alright, so let's talk about arpeggios. So what are arpeggios? Look, I'm assuming if you're watching this course of videos, you're probably already aware of what they are and pretty comfortable with them. But let's just take a little bit of time for perhaps some of those people that aren't quite cool with them. So basically, for the way that we're going to talk about them and the way that we're going to use them, an arpeggio is just a way of playing the notes in a chord one at a time. So for example, if we take a C major 7 chord, within that chord we have the notes C, E, G, and B. So very basically, an arpeggio would be simply playing those notes one at a time. So for example, something like this. C, E, G, B. And we can apply that to any chord type we have. So maybe a minor 7, a C minor 7, we'd have C, E flat, G, B flat. Or a C dominant 7, C, E, G, B flat. Now obviously there's a little bit of chord theory behind that. If you're not comfortable with any of that, please ask me a question by commenting down below or hit me up via my website. But for our purposes throughout this entire course, and for the way that I kind of use arpeggios for when I'm improvising, basically I'm thinking that an arpeggio is a way of playing a chord one note at a time. So what are the ways that we can use arpeggios? Well, the first most obvious use for them is to outline the chord that's happening at a particular moment in time. So for example, if we had a D minor 7 chord playing at any point in a song, we could use our arpeggio, the D minor 7 arpeggio, to play over the top of that chord. The other way that we can sometimes use those is to kind of outline different colors over other chords that might be happening. So for example, a substitution that we might use is if we had a C major 7 chord playing, but we really wanted to accent the 9th of that chord, which in that case would be a D. I might use something like an E minor 7 arpeggio. So while a C major 7 is playing, I'll play an E minor 7 arpeggio over the top. Another way that we can kind of think of the application of these is to just kind of add intervallic interest to any of the lines that we might be playing. So whereas last week we looked at all our major scales and how we could play those over grooves and just in any kind of soloing situation, if we use our arpeggios within that context as well, it can often add a little bit of interest. If we have lines that just kind of sound like this all the time, get a little bit tiresome after a while. So adding in some arpeggio shapes into our normal scalar lines can really add some intervallic interest, rather than something like this. You know, we can maybe put some of our arpeggios in there as well. Arpeggios generally end up sounding quite melodic as well, and you'll notice if you investigate any kind of old, really catchy melodies that generally you'll find that within those melodies, the melody note will be reflecting the chord at the time. So basically we've got a few main applications of arpeggios. We can outline the chord that's happening at the time. We can lean on colors of chords that are happening at the time. We can add intervallic interest to our lines. And also, in general, our arpeggios are quite a melodic texture. Now, you might have noticed back in the introduction that I was talking about something called a 2-1-2 arpeggio, as opposed to a traditional arpeggio shape. Now, usually on guitar, there's ways that we'll learn arpeggios. For example, a C major 7 might look something like this. A C dominant 7. The arpeggio shapes rather that I generally use in my own playing are based around a 2-1-2 system. This is just a preference of mine. It's something that I feel works under my fingers very well. So this week I've included the normal traditional shapes that we'd learn as well in the PDFs. The PDFs that I sent out with week 1 will include all the 2-1-2 shapes that I use. 2-1-2 shapes for these kind of arpeggios will look something more like this. So for example, a G major 7 might look... or a C7. I just kind of like those because they fit under my fingers nice and they're a nice way to move around the fretboard. But I will include the traditional shapes this week with PDFs that are included with the lesson. And if you request the week 1 PDFs, they'll have my 2-1-2 shapes that I use. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about arpeggios, let's look at some ways of really getting them under our fingers. There's a few exercises that I really like to use to learn them. So let's go through those. Within these, I'm going to use those 2-1-2 shapes that I generally lean upon. But you can, of course, apply any of these ideas to any other type of arpeggio shape that you like to use, whether it's traditional or something that you came up with yourself. First one is a really obvious one, just going straight up and down the arpeggio. So let's look at something like an A minor 7 arpeggio. All I do with that is simply run up and down the arpeggio, nothing tricky. This is a really basic one and it really just gets that shape just comfortable under our hands. Important to use a metronome with this stuff. I would really suggest using a metronome based around first quarter notes, 8th notes and 16th notes, and any combination of those. It's really important to make sure that we're still working on our time while we're learning all these technical things as well. The second exercise I really like to use is a 2-note grouping. This is quite a melodic little pattern and is maybe reminiscent of something you might hear in Greg Howe's playing. He's a player I absolutely love, and I actually got this little pattern from a part of his solo in a song called Jumpstart. Basically all we do here is go down 1 note, up 2, down 1, up 2, down 1, up 2. So let me show you. So for example, in that A minor 7 arpeggio again, I'd simply start on the second note, go back to the first note, start on the third note, go back to the second, fourth, back to the third note. Together it all ends up sounding like this. It's quite a cool little pattern when you kind of use it in a line somewhere. The next pattern we can try practicing is a 4-note grouping. So this one's quite similar. We just go up 4 notes in sequences up through the arpeggio shape and back down again. Again in A minor, that would look something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, starting from the first note of the arpeggio. 1, 2, 3, 4, starting from the second note of the arpeggio. Kind of cool little sound as well. I really like that one. Alright, the last exercise that we'll talk about this week is similar to one that we used last week with our major scale, and that's basically taking our arpeggios around through the cycle of fourths. This one really requires that you know your shapes a little bit better, so maybe leave this one until you're quite comfortable finding all the arpeggios over the fretboard. So starting from A minor again, what we do here is we play an A minor arpeggio. We go to the next note in the cycle of fourths, which in this case would be D. Back to A again. Then the next note in the cycle of fourths after D, which would be G. Back to A. Next note in the cycle of fourths again, which would be C. And then back to A again. And we take this around through the entire cycle of fourths from whichever chord you start on. So that might sound something like this. So we'd start off with A minor, up to D minor, just the closest one you can find. In this case, I found one on the 5th string here. Back to A minor 7. Closest G minor shape I can find. Let's just use this one 2 frets below. Back to A minor. Closest C minor we can find. Now I know a shape here, so I'm going to use that one. Then back to A minor again. So if I do that in sequence, A, D, A, G, A, C. That's another really good one for just getting used to swapping between different tonalities with your arpeggios. It's a really helpful one, but maybe leave that until you're quite comfortable with the shapes first. Alright, so let's talk about using the backing tracks that I'm including this week for doing a bit of practice with these arpeggios. I've included 3 tracks this week. Now the first one I'm going to play for you today is going to be one of the most boring tracks I'm going to put together for you during this whole course. It's just a 2-5-1 in C major. For those of you that don't know, a 2-5-1 in C means that we're playing the second note from C major, which would be D minor 7, the 5th note from C major, which would be G7, and the first chord from C major, which would be C major 7. Again, a little bit of chord theory there. If you want to ask any questions, just comment below or hit me up via the website and we'll get through that. So what I'm going to look at here is playing a D minor 7 arpeggio here, just off the tonic, a G7, and a C major 7. And the chord progression will have 1 bar of D minor 7, 1 bar of G7, then 2 bars of C major 7. So let's play it for a little bit and I'll show you what I mean. D minor 7, G7 for 1 bar, C major 7 for 2 bars. And I'm just going to play the arpeggio for each chord. what we're doing there is simply outlining the chord that's happening at that particular moment in time, which, as we mentioned before, is one of the applications of arpeggios. I try to use different subdivisions of that, so practice them in eighth notes, practice them in 16th notes, triplets, or even coming down each arpeggio rather than going up. That's how I like to use these. Later on we can look at substitutions and things for these. Another thing that you can do is just kind of play around within that arpeggio shape once you're comfortable with it. So let's try that. I'm going to set the backing track going, and I'm just going to solo within each arpeggio shape rather than just running up and down. These are 2 bars of C major and back to the top. D minor 7, G7, C major 7. So there, hopefully I've given you a little example of how you can use that track to practice. The other way we could use this track as well is with our C major 3-note per scale arpeggios from last week, so feel free to use it like that as well. Okay, so the next track is a little bit more fun. This is just a static D minor 7 tonality, or D Dorian. What I would use this kind of track for, which is just one key centered through the whole piece, even though there sounds like a little bit of movement, we can just play D Dorians straight through the whole thing. So what I'd use this for is maybe just practicing in that one tonality. So any of those examples that we used before, the 2-note intervals, or the 4, or running up and down the chord shape. Another one that I like to use these kind of tracks for is to run up my 2-1-2 arpeggios diatonically. So this will be related to those shapes that are included in week 1's package, where I'm going to play up through the scale off each scale tone of the chord. So off the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th or 7th, I'm going to go straight to the 7th. And back to the tonic again. So let's hear that over the top of this chord progression. So starting on the tonic and then moving up through the scale with my 2-1-2 arpeggios. Off the tonic. Off the 2nd. Off the 3rd. 4th, 5th, 7th, and tonic again. Try going up one and down the next one. So there's another way to practice over that static chord backing track. That lets us get a bit of an idea of what each of those inversions or different versions of that arpeggio sound like. So once you're comfortable with your 2-1-2 arpeggios, that's a good way to practice over that track. Of course, we can simply use that with our normal traditional arpeggio shapes as well, if you're more comfortable with those ones. So the last backing track that I've included this week is more of a diatonic kind of pop chord progression. So this includes the chords C major, G7, D minor, and F major. This one you can treat as a bit more of a free-for-all. So we can either outline the chords that are happening at the time, we can just try some of our arpeggio shapes and see what they sound like, and we can also use any of our 3-note per string major scales from last week as well. So you can think of this more as a jam track, and we can use some of our arpeggio shapes in here if we like. So let's have a bit of a play over that and see what it sounds like. So you can see there I was using a little bit of arpeggios, a little bit of scales, and just letting my hands go where they needed to. Hopefully following my ear. You might have also recognized that as the one that I was playing over at the top of the video this week. Well, there you go. So hopefully this week I've given you some exercises and ideas to help you really learn your arpeggio shapes, whether they be the 2-1-2 arpeggios that I mentioned or the more traditional shapes. So bearing in mind that all we're doing in these first few weeks is really trying to get these techniques under our fingers, the major scales and the arpeggios, so that we can use them to really work on our improvising. Next week we're going to start looking at chromatic notes and some rhythmic placement ideas, which will really start to push us more into the realm of actually improvising rather than just learning scales and arpeggios. But hopefully the techniques that I've given you over these couple of weeks will really help you learn those shapes, so that when we're looking at soloing and improvising later on in the course, we won't need to worry too much about what notes we're playing or what arpeggio shape we'll need. Again, if you need any of the PDFs or MP3s from this week, please comment down below, or hit me up via my website, and I'll be more than happy to send them to you straight away as soon as I get them to your inbox. Thanks so much, guys. I'm really enjoying doing this with you, and I really hope you are too. Thanks to all the people that have contacted me so far, and I'm looking forward to the next 7 weeks of my guitar improv primer. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next week. Okay, so you stayed through to the end, or just fast forwarded to the end, right? Well, either way, you've made it through to the end of the video. So here's my deal for all my subscribers. If you're already a subscriber, or if you click down below now and subscribe to my channel, I'm going to offer to you a free one-on-one guitar lesson with me. We can go over any of the concepts we've been talking about in these videos, or anything else you'd like to talk about, music theory or songs you've been working on. All you need to do is subscribe, then send me a message through the contact page of my website, andrewweirguitarist.com. Let me know you'd like a lesson and I'll book you in, and the first 1 hour lesson with me, one-on-one online, is free. Thanks so much for sticking around, guys, and I'll see you next week.